Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Hello, echoing Jan's welcome. And thanks for coming to the July event in our Scholars Library series. It's nice to see a couple of familiar faces and some new ones as well. For those who haven't been here before, each month we run these events, and this initiative allows a scholar to come and talk about their literary works to those within the Rhodes community and also beyond it as well. And we really appreciate you taking the time to come along. And today we're really excited to welcome Mark Abley to talk about his book, A Strange Bewildering Time. And fellow Rhodes Scholar Jan Chen is here to moderate the conversation. Jan is currently the Programme and Impact Lead at the Atlantic Institute, which is a partner programme of the Rhodes Trust, which supports lifelong fellowship and community building amongst Atlantic Fellows. And she studied an MSc in social anthropology when she was in residence. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jan, who's going to give you a further introduction to Mark and the session as well, and we can get into it. So if you've got any questions, we'll have time at the end to do those, and you can put them in the chat or raise your hand later. But over to you, Jan.
Thank you so much, Georgie. And it is truly a delight to be moderating this conversation with Mark. And so I'm a 2019 scholar from China, and those of us who are here feel welcome to put in the chat, if you're part of the Rhodes community or if you're a guest, which year you are from. I am particularly excited to be moderating this conversation, given my background in the humanities and the arts, and also my excitement for intergenerational dialogue. And so I'll just briefly introduce Mark before we talk a little bit more about the book, hear from Mark some passages from the book, and then launch into a Q&A about various aspects of the book. And as Georgie said, at the end, we'll have the opportunity for you to pose your questions as well. Feel free to put your questions in the chat during the conversation too, and we will address those together at the end. So Mark Abley is a Rhodes Scholar from 1975, hailing from Western Canada, from Saskatchewan. And Mark is a nonfiction writer, poet, and journalist, and he has published many books, including The Organist, Fugues, Fatherhood, and A Fragile Mind, which is a memoir of his father. He has also published many books on language, a book that presents an unconventional look at Canada's past called Conversations with a Dead Man, The Legacy of Duncan Campbell Scott. He has also published several poetry collections and children's books. In short, Mark has been a very prolific writer, and his work has won international praise and has been translated into 5 languages, and he currently lives in Montreal. So today we're here to talk about Mark's latest book, which was published in, I believe, February of this year, right, Mark?
Yep.
And it is called Strange Bewildering Time, Istanbul to Kathmandu in the last year of the Hippie Trail. So Mark, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about this trip that the book covers, first of all, to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jan. And thank you also to the Rhodes Trust, Georgie in particular, but also the Rhodes Trust for giving me this opportunity. It's a delight to be here, and a delight to see the names and sometimes the faces of people I recognize and those whom I don't recognize too. I was at Oxford from 1975 to 1978. And in April 1978, I skipped out of my final few months as a Rhodes Scholar. I'd had a wonderful time at St. John's for more than 2.5 years, but I seized the chance to travel across parts of West and South Asia in what was called at that time the Hippie Trail. And I traveled through Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, parts of North India, and finally Nepal. We expected to get to Afghanistan, but we couldn't get to Afghanistan because a Marxist coup had closed the borders, and so we had to skirt around Afghanistan and not actually see that country. And I was traveling with a young English woman called Claire Gittings, who was a historian at Oxford. And we were not romantic partners. We were good friends, but we were not romantically involved. And we were gone for 3 months. And in the course of those 3 months, I took some very detailed notes. As you'll see from, this is just one of my notebooks, and all of them look like this, about 120 pages of those kinds of notes. That's what made it possible to write this book.
Sorry, I was muted. That's amazing, Mark. And we just saw those notebooks with those incredibly meticulous notes. And I have here, my camera is blurred, sorry. But I have here, okay, here we go. This is the published book. You can see it, yeah. And so from the notebooks to this book, it's taken 45 years. And so Mark, I just want to start by asking you, for those of us who weren't born in, your era, what is the Hippie Trail and what is so significant about the Hippie Trail?
Well, hundreds of thousands of young Westerners made this kind of journey in the 1960s and 70s, mostly going west to east, but sometimes for those who were from Australia and New Zealand, going east to west. And for those who were going west to east, we would start off in London or Amsterdam or Paris, get to Istanbul, and then go overland. In some places, the trip overlapped with the ancient Silk Road from China to the west. And what it represented, I think, in retrospect, was kind of opening up to other cultures, a recognition that Western European culture, for all its glories and difficulties, that was not the only great culture in the world. There was a desire, there was an idealism, there was a yearning to get to know different parts of the world and experience different cultures. So there was an idealism. I mean, one of the writers whom everyone was reading on the so-called Hippie Trail was Hermann Hesse, the German novelist. And Hesse wrote a novella called Journey to the East, in which he described the East as the home and youth of the soul. And that was the sort of aspirational aspect of the Hippie Trail, if you like. However, it was also problematic, and I'm sure we'll get to discuss some of the problems a bit later, Jan. But I mean, the people who were journeying on the Hippie Trail, we really didn't stop to think very much, I think, about the impact that we were having on people in those particular cultures. And the English writer Bruce Chatwin, whom I admire a great deal, Bruce Chatwin actually ascribed some of the blame for the downfall of Afghanistan to the hippies on the Hippie Trail, who were not respecting local culture, who were engaging in practices, sexual mores, whatever, that were completely antithetical to the Afghan people. And he thought that the Hippie Trail had driven Afghans into the arms of the Marxists. So, that's just one possible example. But in Pakistan, in India, in Nepal, Sri Lanka, for those who went to Sri Lanka, there were certainly ways in which the Hippie Trail was not the idealistic, innocent phenomenon that we assumed at the time it was. And the subtitle of the book is The Last Year of the Hippie Trail, because in 1978, like I mentioned, the Afghan borders closed. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And as well as that, the Iranian Revolution in January 1979 completely closed Iran to foreign travel.
Thank you for that intro. Thank you so much for that intro and background, Mark. When I was, reading the book, I also noticed that you mentioned it was your first time being in third world countries, right? And I actually learned, I was enlightened to learn that, third world was referring to the countries outside of the US and Soviet blocs, right? Because I think I've always thought of it as more of an economic term, but here I think it's more of a political term. And so I was really, I think, enlightened by that. I think
nowadays,
yes.
I think nowadays we tend to use the term global south, but in the Cold War era, there was the United States and its allies, the Soviet Union and its allies or client states, and then all the poorer parts of the world got lumped together as the third world.
Yeah. And I think that's a reminder, right, of, the distance that the world has traveled within these 45 years, and to think about, what kind of a different world that you were facing, right, when you were setting off on that journey. And so next, I think it would be amiss to be having this conversation without having Mark share some passages from this work to give everyone a sense of the richly textured writing and the vividly sensory details that goes into this book. So Mark, would you mind just taking us on a brief journey by letting us dive into an excerpt of the book?
Thank you, Jan. I'm going to read just one passage, and it's from Tabriz in northwestern Iran. And to set the scene a little bit, Tabriz is in a part of Iran where the language spoken is not only Farsi, the language of Persia or Iran, but also Azeri, the language of Azerbaijan. It's a border region. And this is 1978, when there had already begun to be protests against the Shah's regime. The protests were gathering strength, but Claire and I had really no sense of how significant those protests were likely to be, nor of who was doing the protesting. What sounds do foreign travelers hear? In Tabriz, speaking neither Farsi nor Azeri, Claire and I were oblivious to everything except the wordless noises of a modern city, engines firing and backfiring, horns, the odd siren, doors opening, doors closing, the yawps and cackles of hundreds of starlings roosting on high branches along the boulevard. Cassettes and transistor radios played music we did not recognize. Cries and whispers made use of languages we did not know. Little wonder that English-speaking tourists go out sightseeing, not sound hearing. And what sights do foreign travelers see and recall? To wander through a land where not just the food, the religion, the buildings, and the climate, but also the national alphabet is foreign. All this can deliver a burst of what Arthur Rimbaud believed every poet needed to experience, a long, boundless, systematic derangement of the senses. The notes I made in Tabriz have a visual clarity about them, along with an almost complete lack of context and history. Many of the shops in the bazaar had defied the call to close, and in one that remained open, we saw a white Persian cat lying asleep on a cushion. A samovar stood between the dormant cat and an oval tray bearing an image of the Mona Lisa. We touched and admired the ceramic lid of a beehive, elegantly glazed in blue, purple, and black, in a small antique shop that also sold copperware, clocks, and carpets of an intricate geometrical design. Near the bazaar, we passed a grocery store with the word Canada Dry on its open door, and a young woman in a black chador standing inside, looking out. Ginger ale was part of her life. I was not. What Claire and I saw in the city streets, we did not understand. Was it on government orders that 2 mosques we tried to visit were shut? A crowd had gathered outside a 3rd mosque. The men spoke in low voices, if they spoke at all. Squads of riot police, their rifles prominent, waited on open trucks. More policemen, or were they soldiers, stood ready down a side street. Walls and street lamps were smeared with photocopies showing the bearded faces of young men, students killed here in February during protests against the Shah's regime. In their blurred eyes, I read a tale of hope and defiance. Death had transformed the students into martyrs. But were they martyrs for a shared vision of the future, or was the Shah's overthrow their only common aim? In my journal, I wrote, I wish the rebels every success. I did not know who the rebels were. I think that's enough.
Thank you, Mark. I just wanted to take a brief moment and to let that sink in. And I really enjoyed that passage, or I think that passage is very representative because of how it engages us sensorially. And, as you point out, little wonder that English-speaking tourists go out sightseeing, not sound hearing, right? And I think that that's a really sensitive observation. I also really appreciate the bringing in of the social historical context, as well as, the reflectiveness on how a younger you were kind of less able to perceive, right, that context back then. So I think this is a really good representative passage from the book. And I'd just like to start our Q&A by just thinking about how travel has changed, right, in these 45 years. And, you wrote that our route would be established by improvisation and common sense, spiced with an occasional dash of guidebook insight. And you also mentioned in the book that you try to take, local transport, right, avoiding the kind of tourist buses or trains. So for me, as someone who was born in the 90s and who's a frequent user of, TripAdvisor and Yelp and Airbnb when I do travel, it's hard to imagine that back then, you said even Lonely Planet was in its infancy. Wow. So what would you say is the chief difference for you between travel then and traveling now? And how has it influenced the way that we write about travel?
The great difference, I think, Jan, is that we were really out of touch. There was no internet. So of course there was no Wi-Fi, there was no Yelp, there was no TripAdvisor, whatever. The only means we had of staying in touch with loved ones was that we would go in a few capital cities, Tehran, Delhi, Kathmandu. We would go to the post office and pick up letters and cards that had been sent to us by means of poste restante. So the address would be simply Mark Abley, poste restante, Tehran, Iran. So we would, so this would be like a box or a pigeonhole into which these letters and cards would come. Otherwise, we had no contact with our loved ones because international phone calls were hideously expensive as well as complicated to arrange. This meant that we were, in a sense, more ignorant than travelers would be now, because we couldn't stop and turn on our phone and look to see, oh, what's the population of Tabriz? Oh, how many, what's the percentage of the population that speaks Azeri? We couldn't do any of that. We were reliant on whatever we picked up or learned along the way. But as a writer, I think in a way this was very helpful because it meant that we were totally immersed in the culture. We were not constantly thinking of where else we could be, and we were just so thrown into the moment that Conrad wrote in The Destructive Element, Immerse, and that was really how it was for us. The only guidebook we had was this Student Guide to Asia, published by the Australian Union of Students. And the smallness of its print rivals the smallness of my obsessive handwriting. And it really wasn't a very good guidebook. So, but that was the only thing we had. Otherwise, we were just lost in the moment, or perhaps found in the moment.
Yeah, I'm looking at the passage in your book where it says the book devoted only 5 pages to Turkey, nearly all of them on Istanbul, compared to its 17 pages on Singapore and 56 on Indonesia. And I think that speaks to, the unevenness of our perception about the world, which I think is true back then, but also now. And I also feel that, the abundance of photos and travel logs that we have can conceal or can, create a kind of illusion that, we know more about the world. But I think what you're mentioning about the total immersion in a culture, right, is actually crucial to us really knowing about the world, not just information, right?
And what travel writing can do, sorry to interrupt, but what literary travel writing can do that no guidebook, whether in printed or electronic form, can do, is to give a sense of the smells, the sounds, the tastes, the feel of a culture.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll ask you more questions about writing in a bit. But for now, I am thinking about this journey, right, both in geography, but also in time. And you wrote this book 45 years after your actual journey. And so in that sense, it's also an engagement between your older and younger selves. So how has that process of, self-discovery been for you? And can you talk more about, the things that you now see about your younger self more clearly? And, are there things that you wish you now had, which, he had back then?
Yeah, I'm kind of appalled at my high-mindedness and my pomposity and my self-importance. I began to learn some humility on the trip, and I hope I've gone on learning some humility since then. But apart from that, I also kind of sneakily admired the intrepidness that I had back then, the willingness to do some kind of wild and crazy things. I mean, at one point, we were in rural Turkey, and by chance we stayed in a hostel where a clerk tried to sell us on disco folklore. And me at my age now, I would not go to anything that called itself disco folklore. But at the time we thought, what the hell, let's do it. So we did, and it wasn't exactly a pleasurable experience, but it was certainly a memorable one. So I'm pleased to find in retrospect, reading my journals, that I did have the willingness to do that kind of thing. But I'm also, like I said, a little appalled at my high-mindedness, and also I'm at a much more important level, really. I'm also aware of my own ignorance. I mean, innocence would be putting it nicely. But, I'd grown up in Western Canada, the child of British immigrants. And although my politics were, mildly left of center, I tended to think that the British Empire had not been all that terrible a thing. And I thought that when in India, for instance, that the British Empire had brought railways and cricket and a modest level of prosperity. And I had no idea that actually when the British and the East India Company arrived in India, India was far richer and contributed far more to the global economy than Britain did. And the wealth of Victorian England, which is so important to, for example, the development of Oxford and Oxford University, was largely funded by the exploitation of India. So I did not know this when I was traveling, and I tried to make that kind of discovery part of the book I was writing.
Yeah, something I really appreciate is the kind of reflectiveness that you've just demonstrated, right? The willingness to admit to the relative ignorance of your younger self. And again, quoting from the book, right, you recognize that I had enjoyed vast privilege based on vast injustice. And I think it's really, important that you do bring that reflectiveness to this account. And I just on that note, I want to ask, just thinking about our perception, right, of the East and of areas that are far away from us and traveling unfamiliar lands. There can be a tension between the excitement of travel, right, to an unfamiliar place, but also the danger of exoticizing these places, and the danger of exoticizing the people who live in these places, and of being extractive when you're writing about them. So did you encounter those tensions when you were writing this work? And how do you think we should be, traveling responsibly and ethically and writing about it in, the spirit, while maintaining our spirit of exploration and curiosity and imagination?
That's a great question, but also a really big question. And to try and boil down, I could talk for a long time about this. Just to boil it down a bit, I was very aware in the writing of the concept of Orientalism. Edward Said's landmark book, Orientalism, was published in late 1978. In other words, Said would have been writing or editing or proofreading the book while we were traveling, but we had no concept of Orientalism, meaning the way that Western travelers, thinkers, writers, artists, intellectuals had assumed the privilege of talking about and discussing and claiming to understand foreign cultures and giving them a sort of veneer of aesthetic asceticism and exoticism, as you say. And I really didn't want to do that as much as possible. I mean, that's an ever-present danger in writing about the journey and the marvelous buildings that we saw, for example, although, you know, the buildings are only a very small part of the book. One book that was really key to me as I wrote the book was a pretty obscure book now that came out in the 1950s by an Indian writer, Nirad Chowdhury. Chowdhury was a Bengali writer, and he made a trip to Britain, funded by the British Council, actually, in the early 1950s. And then he wrote a passage to England, playing, of course, on E.M. Forster's Passage to India. He wrote a Passage to England, which is a nonfiction account of what he experienced in Oxford and other cities in England. And it showed me that, you know, that people can have very fine-tuned and interesting perceptions of a foreign culture, but they can also seem actually quite bizarre to the people who were there. And I was trying, but you know, for example, I say in the book how overwhelmed I was at points by the sheer noise of India. India, to anyone who's going there for the first time, not on a five-star hotel basis, anyone is going to find that the volume of sound in Indian cities is pretty overwhelming. And Chowdhury points out that cheerfulness is an essential, that noise is an essential condition of cheerfulness to people in India. And he says that we Indians do not want to live in speechless adjacence the way cattle and the English people do. So he's putting the English people beside cattle, which is kind of sly of him. And anyway, it was that kind of anti-Orientalism that I drew on to an extent in writing the book. I would say that that in traveling, it's really important. In terms of ethical travel, it's really important to listen, not to think we have all the answers. Even if TripAdvisor tells us something, it ain't necessarily so. And to be open to friendly, productive encounters with people in whatever countries we're traveling through, and to recognize that they have their own perspective, they have their own interests, they have their own desires, and they have their own wisdom.
Yeah, I love that description of friendly and productive encounters. And I hope that, you know, this tension that I mentioned is also, you know, in your book, a productive tension, right? As you mentioned to me in a previous conversation. And I also recall you mentioning the authors that you quoted in the book and how you made a very deliberate choice on who you were quoting. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Sure, thank you, Jan. In a way, the obvious precursor to this book is one that came out in the late 1970s by the American writer Paul Theroux, who's a travel writer as well as a novelist. And Theroux traveled through Asia along the same route that I did, but also went much further. And he wrote a book called The Old Railway Bazaar, which was a smash hit and sold something like 1.2 million copies. And I think it may still be his best known book. And Theroux is a tremendously shrewd and smart and snappy writer, but he could also be very sardonic, even dismissive about the cultures he was traveling through. And I didn't want to do that. Theroux just assumed that Anglo-American culture and the English language should reign supreme. And I absolutely didn't want to follow him as a model. And I decided that that Theroux and other really good travel writers, even Bruce Chatwin, whom I greatly admire and who was kind of a model for me in some ways when I was the younger writer, even Chatwin, Theroux, Robert Byron, who wrote so well about Afghanistan, I was not going to quote these people. Instead, I was going to quote writers from the countries in question, so that when I'm in Turkey, for example, I quote Orhan Pamuk writing about Istanbul. When I'm writing about Iran, I quote Rumi and Hafez and Attar and some of the great Persian poets, as well as the Iranian-American novelist Delia Sofer. In Pakistan, I quote Mohsen Hamid. In India, I quote Arundhati Roy and Salman Rushdie. And I was very, very lucky with Nepal, because there were not many Nepali writers who've been translated into English, but a good friend of mine, Harold Hoefel, who's a writer in Montreal, who'd spent a year teaching in Nepal. Harold had bought a book called Unwritten by a Nepali writer, and it's a novel set in a village in South Nepal, and I was able to quote that. And then by chance, I'd actually met the author at a Congress of the International Writers Group, PEN, in Canada some years later. So that was a wonderful kind of closing of the circle, if you like. But in other words, one way I was trying to reduce or minimize the Orientalist danger in the book would be to use writers from those countries for their perceptions, rather than just to say that Paul Theroux wrote this and Naipaul wrote this and Chapman wrote that.
I really appreciate the image of international dialogue, literary dialogue and exchange that you just mentioned, Mark. And just thinking about the writing of this book, could you speak, you mentioned this, some of this already, but who were the writers and books that inspired you in the writing process? And how did you draw from or maybe veer away from those writers and those works that inspired you?
I guess what I want to say maybe is that the book is a memoir of a kind, but it's also a travel log, a literary travel log, and that's a form, a genre that, with the rise of the internet, TripAdvisor, Yelp, etc., has become a bit less accepted, a bit less, a bit more marginal in the literary world. In the 1930s, it was a very flourishing genre, and some of the major British and American writers, like Graham Greene, wrote travel books. Greene would often write a travel book, for instance, about Mexico, and then a few months later produce a novel set in the same sort of landscape. But there is that kind of imperial danger at work there, in that Graham Greene assumed he could go to Mexico and understand what was going on. And while I loved his novel, The Power and the Glory, set in Oaxaca in southern Mexico and Chiapas, I hated the travel book that he wrote there, because he was so cruel and pretty vicious, in fact, toward Mexican people. So there was that. One of the books that I loved as a boy was John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie. Steinbeck, again, a major novelist, but as an older man, he was getting towards 60. He left home, traveled around the United States in a camper van with a large dog. Charlie is the dog, not a human being. And he wrote about the United States and his perceptions of the US. And that was a book that my parents had on their shelves when I was a boy, and I must have read it 2 or 3 times when I was growing up. So those were key books for me. And in a way, what I was trying to do, if this doesn't sound a little too pretentious, was sort of to try and revive that sort of genre of travel writing, but for an audience that may not accept travel writing as a legitimate genre because of the obvious dangers and the risks that I've been talking about.
And speaking of genre, so this book, I think it straddles the genres of literary travel writing and memoir. And I think a lot of the language is also very poetic, right? And it almost kind of sometimes spans poetry and prose. So can you speak a bit more about how you navigated those forms and genres while writing the book, if that was at all a relevant thought for you?
Yeah, it was a relevant thought, and I'm glad you used the word poetic, but it's also another word that can send up a bunch of orange flags. I don't want to say red flags, because I did want the book to be very readable. And if someone hears, oh, it's written in poetic prose, I don't want anyone to think, oh, it's written in this pretentious highfalutin prose, that kind of thing. But yeah, I thought of myself as a poet. I aspired to be a great poet when I was young. And over the years, poetry has kind of died away in me, but I hope some of the qualities that make a good poem can also make good prose writing. Vividness of physical detail, for example. As for the memoir question, I had, my previous book was a memoir. It was a book about my father and my younger self. It was called The Organist, my dad being the organist. And I had the experience there of having to create myself as a character, if you like. And so I was trying to do the same thing in this book, but the risk of creating myself as a character was that this could easily come to seem narcissistic, you know, like, and a reader or a potential reader could easily say, you know, who is this guy? And why should I be reading about his long ago trip through Asia? So I was treading a fine line there between creating myself and to some extent Claire as well, my traveling companion, as constant characters to run through the book in the same way that the memoir has characters, but not focusing just on ourselves. The main focus, you know, I wanted to be on the cultures and the landscapes and the time I was traveling through, because that sense of time was really significant for me.
So speaking of, you know, how the book traverses and introduces to us cultures and landscapes and time, I want to ask you a meta question. What has been your journey of writing this book that is about a journey?
To give as unmeta an answer as they can, you know, I kept the journal partly or mostly at the time because I thought it would provide images for poetry. I've never been someone who keeps a diary regularly in everyday life, but I've always liked to keep a kind of journal, a diary when traveling. And I did write a suite of poems following the trip, in the year following the trip. And then I put the notebooks aside and I didn't look at them again for many, many years. So there was this sense of rediscovering who I was so long ago. But, you know, if the book has any value, what I think it might be is in showing what it was like to be a young man, a young Westerner, a young traveler in 1978, at a time, for example, before climate change was a thing, when no one was worried at all about biodiversity, about climate change. So we traveled past lakes that don't exist anymore. In the great city of Isfahan in Iran, we threw a coin for luck down into a river. The river has since dried up. The river's name in Farsi was the giver of life. That river doesn't exist anymore. We passed within a few miles of a lake in southeastern Iran where the seat of the prophet Zoroaster was said to lie. And for Zoroastrians, the final redemption of the world would emerge out of that lake. The lake doesn't exist anymore because the Helmand River in Afghanistan was dammed, so there's no lake anymore. In Kashmir, we climbed over a glacier that has shrunk by 30 or 40% since we were there. I mean, I could give plenty of other examples too, and I don't want the book to come across as a sort of political screed or polemical screed, but as well as showing some of the political changes of the time. For example, in Iran, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and the difficult position of women that would only worsen in the decades to come, as well as showing that. I wanted to be able to show how time has inflicted all sorts of changes, environmentally speaking, as well. That's not a very meta answer, Jan. I'm sorry.
No, I think it was actually added a very important and necessary dimension, right, to our previous discussion about, you know, traveling ethically and responsibly, and it adds an additional dimension as well, I think, to you know, when we were talking about how it was a world that had changed, right, and many things back then had disappeared. But I think the climate and environmental dimension is really sobering, right? And you mentioned that, you know, time had made those changes on the environment, but it's equally, right, us, it's equally people. And I think this is a really good reminder of how none of our activities and none of our, political, social kind of occurrences can be divorced from the environment that we live in. So thank you so much for bringing in that dimension.
And to tie, can I just tie up very quickly? I tie up two things, or try to tie up two things that you were asked or talking about. When I get to Kathmandu, because Kathmandu has grown from about 200,000 in 1978 to 2 million people today. Forests have been cut down. The Kathmandu Valley is, for those who live there, a much more difficult place to live, serious lack of drinking water. And I say all that, but at the same time, Nepal is now a democracy of sorts, which it wasn't in 1978. Life expectancy has grown a lot. For women, the rate of death in childbirth is much lower than it was in 1978. So do I have a right to complain about the environmental changes as a foreigner? I'm not a Nepali person. Who am I to make these observations? And yet I feel I needed to make them.
Thank you. I think I really appreciate how your perspective adds nuance, right, to this question, and to I think the enduring question of environment versus economic development, and does it have to be versus, and also are we asking those questions more of developing countries and not of the countries that are already developed and that have gone through the Industrial Revolution, have reaped the benefits of it, right? So I would like to go back to your kind of overall body of work as a writer, and ask you, how would you situate this work within your entire body of work?
The first book I wrote was a travel book based on a 3-month journey, but not this 3-month journey, another 3-month journey. I realized at a certain point when I was about 30 that I did not understand the prairie provinces where I'd grown up and which I'd been so keen to get out of when I was a young man. So I rented a car and drove around Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba for 3 months, and then wrote a book about it. And then in mid-career, I wrote 2 books, which are sort of travel books, but not entirely, or not in the usual sense. The one, in a way, that I'm most proud of is Spoken Here, Travels Among Threatened Languages, in which I've visited Indigenous peoples in Oklahoma, in Northern Australia, the Isle of Man, the Arctic, other places, and wrote about their attempts to preserve their languages. So this is a kind of travel book that, with a thematic context or the political context. And then I followed that up with a book called The Prodigal Tongue, Dispatches from the Future of English, in which I went to Japan and Singapore and LA and wrote about the versions of English that are spoken in places like that. And now finally this book. So in a way, it seems that travel has been a sort of golden thread running through my work.
That leads perfectly into my next question for you, which is, how do you think the experience of travel influences you or has influenced you as a writer? And, how does it, I guess both influence the content of which, you're working on, but also the craft, right? And the style and all, how you function as a writer, how you notice things. How does travel influence you as a writer?
I guess I love traveling even now because it opens my senses. I think we all get so used to the journeys we take every day, the neighborhoods we live in and work in, that sometimes we stop seeing them. We stop realizing what an amazing place. Everywhere in the world is an amazing place in a sense, and travel opens our eyes to that. In perhaps some people use magic mushrooms the same way. I use traveling instead of magic mushrooms.
I love just how I think in your book, you just engage, auditory and tactile experiences and gustatory experiences, and how, those things are so evocative, right? And invoke the kind of multi-sensory experience that is travel.
Yeah, and just to give you a slightly longer or better answer to the previous question, I spent many years working as a feature writer for the Montreal Gazette newspaper in the days when newspapers were much larger, more essential to the culture, and financially more healthy than they are now. And as part of one small part of my time at the Gazette, I had the chance to travel to the Horn of Africa and to write about, I was supposed to write about Canadian forces delivering relief supplies to people in Ethiopia, Somali refugees in Ethiopia. We ended up, the Gazette photographer and I ended up flying on a UN Cessna plane into Somaliland just a few months after the Somali troops had pulled out, and the scene of utter devastation. So on the one hand, what having traveled in Asia allowed me to do was to not be overwhelmed by the terrible shock of what I was seeing in Ethiopia and Somalia, which otherwise might have been completely devastating to me. You know, having traveled having taken 36 hours to travel 400 kilometers on an Indian Railways train where we were crammed into a compartment beyond belief without food or drink or a toilet even. You know, seeing Ethiopia was a bit less shocking to me. But apart from that, in the writing of those articles that I did at the time, I could draw on some of the same skills. Obviously, journalists need other skills too, but I could draw on some of the same skills, I hope, to make the writing as vivid and to put readers of those articles, you know, to make them feel that they could actually see and hear and feel what I experienced in Ethiopia and Somalia. So that's what travel writing has done for me in a very different genre.
Thank you so much, Mark. So I would love to open this up now to our audience members and to see if anyone has any questions, thoughts, comments on the conversation. Please feel free to raise your hand or to type into the chat box if you would like, and I'm very happy to read out your question for you, or to have, or you can also speak up yourself. And please feel free to take a moment just to digest, the conversation that has just taken place, because I know we covered a lot of ground, literally and figuratively.
Oh, okay. I have a question.
Hi, David.
Hey, Mark. Great to see you, and I really enjoyed your remarks. I am the only other member of our cohort on the call, I think. So on behalf of the entire gang, congratulations on this latest milestone in your literary career. I wanted to ask you a question about memory and contemporaneous documentation, because there's good evidence that the more we remember an event, the more we mutate that memory. The greater frequency of recall, we actually shape our memories. They are far from static structures. And you also have the advantage of this journal kept in the moment that things were happening. And similarly, when you and I were at Oxford together, I was writing letters on a daily basis to the woman I married at the end of that year. And so, 47 years later, we're now reading those letters aloud to each other and are stunned by what we did, what we thought, and what we felt. So I want to know, for you, how much of reading your documentation from that time came as a surprise to you, or included things you had no recollection of?
That's a really good question, David. And I guess the answer would be a depressingly large amount of what I read I had no recollection of. I knew I had, for example, we spent several days in Kashmir. This was one of the more relaxed parts of the trip. And I feel so privileged to have had that experience, because Kashmir since 1978 has become so much more militarized and dangerous. And, it's not really a place where many people would even want to visit nowadays. And I could remember certain things. I could remember the houseboat that we stayed on. And I could remember that there was a boy who, I think I would nowadays use the word autistic, although I didn't use it then. There was a boy who did not speak, who was a son of the houseboat owner, a son of the houseboat owner. And he was, I don't think he was in school. He was basically employed doing odd jobs for his father. I remembered him. And I dimly remember that we had clambered across a glacier, but I did not remember any of the details of that. And so it was a complete surprise to me to find out that at the same time as I was clambering across a glacier, so were a party of schoolboys from Calcutta, one of whom called out to me, "Sir, do you have whiskey for sale?" So, it's all thanks to the journal that I can quote that, because memory of that had completely faded.
So, and my follow-up question to that is, obviously there's two components to your writing. One is the content and the other is the style. And similarly, as you look back almost half a century to these writings, are there elements of your style that you say, oh yeah, that's Mark Abley all over again, and other things where you say, thank God I no longer write in that particular vein?
It's 1/4 looking back in admiration and 3/4 looking back in dismay. I mean,
that sounds right.
That's the shorthand version. The longer version would be that, as I said to Jan at the start, I was pretty self-absorbed. And some of that, though, it was, I had been brought up devoutly Christian, and I was losing my Christian faith. And this meant that I was open to other faiths, other cultures. I was staggered by the beauty of the mosques we saw in Iran. I mean, Isfahan is just one of the great, great cities in the world. I was staggered by the beauty of the Golden Temple in Amritsar. And I think, if that is an element that I hope comes through in the writing, it's because at the time I did have that openness to spiritual questions. And as the decades have gone by, I suppose I've sunk more into a sort of spiritual torpor, whereas I don't ask myself those kind of great questions anymore, and I'm not so bothered by having no clear answers. So it's the intensity of the way in which I responded to those kind of buildings and faiths. I think that's something that I hope is to the book's credit.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for your great questions, David. And I mentioned at the start that I loved intergenerational dialogue, right? And just reflecting on how, Mark, you mentioned back in the day, right? Probably very few Westerners wanted to visit Kashmir. And in the past 5 years, though, we have actually had the first two Rhodes Scholars from Kashmir attending Oxford among us. And I hope you'll be able to meet them someday and to talk about these experiences together. Yes, we have another question in the chat. Mishab, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If I'm not, please correct me. But would you like to speak, or would you prefer me to read out your question?
Okay, I will read the question. I have been with our beloved author for the entire speak, whatever the session has, and I gone through the understanding which he got from while he traveling all the way to South Asia, especially to India, to Istanbul, Isfahan, and everywhere. So I read some of the travelogues based on John Crocker. It's based on Into the Wild and Into Thin Air. And when I listened, sorry for my grammatical mistakes and all, I'm from India, so I'm trying to convey my idea, which I have to ask to the author. it's based on most of the arguments are based on the political aspect, and I haven't read that work, and I will be reading. I have read some of the prologue which you have mentioned in that book, and from that itself, and from your speech, I got to know that some of the arguments are entirely based on your political narratives and how we have to see the West and its prominent aspects and all. So, yet my question is about how would you see the contemporary state of affairs of the third world and its potential to achieve its fullest possibility in this contemporary time? How are you seeing this third world from your point of view? That would be
Thank
my
you.
question, and you can go through my question and you can make it understand.
Thank you very much, Mishab. We don't have very much time, so I'll give you a briefer answer than you actually deserve. I don't like to use the term third world these days, and it's partly because of the rise of India and the rise of China to be great powers. I don't think the phrase third world makes that much sense anymore. But I think even within the countries that term third world covers, there's so much difference between countries that are really experiencing a tremendously difficult time. For instance, in many parts of Africa, where there are insurgencies, where there is direct effects of climate change, where there's political instability, and other parts of what we call the third world, where there's been tremendous progress and a lot of good things are happening. So I really want to, in a sense, resist your question, but thank you very much for asking it.
Thank you,
You're
Mark.
welcome, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you so much, Ms. Abb. So we have a few minutes left, and just wanted to see if anybody else would like to ask a question. Yes, Megan, would you like to hop on the mic?
Hi there, Mark from Lake Winnipeg.
Hi, Megan.
And Mark, I think we've talked about this before, but how did Claire's experience of the trip differ from yours?
Thank you, Hedley. Claire traveled as a woman and was sexually accosted in Turkey and was harassed in parts of Pakistan and India. So from that point of view, she suffered experiences that I did not have to deal with at all. She also had to deal with the difficulties of traveling with a morose old sod like me. And she was a student of history, a graduate student in history, and she was very English. So she was to some extent limited by her Englishness, whereas perhaps being a Canadian was helpful to me in some ways. But I did send her a draft of the manuscript. And in fact, the copy of this book, Student Guide to Asia, it's Claire who'd held onto it all these years, not me. And so I'm really grateful to her for reading the manuscript and for, in a sense, vetting it and pointing out certain errors that I had made. And so I dare to hope that the experience wasn't all that different from mine, but I do think that traveling as a woman would have made it really, really different in parts.
That's a really great question. Thank you so much, Megan. And Hadley?
Hedley was
Yes.
a Rhodes Scholar in
Hadley,
1976.
thank you so much.
Hello, David.
Yes, thank you so much. So we are almost at time, and Mark, I just wanted to say we have a few current Rhodes Scholars and scholars-elect in the audience, and many of them are facing questions on what kind of life they would like to choose to live. So succinctly, what would you like to say to them, especially those who are trying to figure out paths that don't follow more traditional trajectories of achievement and success?
I would say try not to put too much pressure on yourself. Being a Rhodes Scholar means that along with the incredible privilege, there's also a good deal of pressure that comes from the expectations of other people. but as much as you can, resist the inward pressures, the inward expectations that you have to achieve this much by the time you're 30, and this much by the time you're 40, and this much by the time you're 50, and so on. Just do whatever you feel most passionate about. I mean, also, of course, you have to earn a living, but to do something that brings you joy and that matches your passion in life, that is what will be the most rewarding and ultimately will help fight the world's fight.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was so eloquently and movingly put. And I hope those of us who are, younger will take away those words and keep them to heart. And that those of us who are older will, remember your days when you were at school together, remember your days at Oxford, and take this as a chance to reflect on the adventures that you can have in life, irregardless of which stage of life you're at. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you so much, Mark, for such a wonderfully rich conversation. And
thank you, Jan. I've enjoyed it no end, and it's a real privilege to be able to chat to you.
It has been wonderful. And may I just advise everyone to please stay tuned for our next session of the Scholars Library, which will be in August, right, Georgie?
Yes, August the 22nd.
Great. Thank you all so much.
See you all later.